give the listeners the context of why we're talking about this, and then I'm going to lean heavily, like I do for most player analysis, I'm going to lean heavily on you for this when it comes to Kotkaniemi and when it comes to Martin Necas. Starting with Kotkaniemi, because this was on Friday's edition of the 32 Thoughts podcast with Elliot Friedman. Both of these nuggets come from Friedman, talking about how Kotkaniemi is a player that the Hurricanes don't plan on buying out this offseason. And he also said the Canucks might be one of the organizations on top of the Hurricanes that likes Kotkaniemi. We've heard him linked to the Canucks in the past. 23-year-old. Let's focus just on him so far, and then I'll talk about Necas after. Let's just focus on Kotkaniemi right now.
Sure, this will be shorter just because I am way more excited about Necas than I am about Kotkaniemi, so I have a lot more like Necas takes. But in the case of Kotkaniemi, when they signed him to an offer sheet, I'm sure that they anticipated him being this middle six stalwart center. He's shown flashes of that ability, but hasn't been able to really take the next step. Now, Kotkaniemi, I anticipate that there's going to be some market for him around the NHL just because he is still so young. He still has pedigree. He also has the type of like large physical frame and baseline defensive reliability that when you combine it with no with even though his offensive production hasn't hit his potential yet, like this is a player that at the end of last season, for example, put up 41 points, I believe it was. Like there's something there. It's just a matter of he's not worth $4.8 million right now. So do you think he can grow into that type of cap hit? Now, for me, from the Canucks perspective, I'd probably be staying away just because, sure, I'd feel confident in Kotkaniemi being a perfectly serviceable third line center, but just not at that cap hit, right? Just not at nearly $5 million when you're already leaning on potentially Connor Garland, who makes nearly $5 million to be the main play driver. If you're spending nearly $5 million on a third line center, that guy better be elite. And Kotkaniemi, maybe he gets there, but he's not there right now. He's coming off a down year. I believe he only had 27 points. His role was reduced, right? I believe he averaged 12 minutes a night this season. But put it this way, if the Canucks bet on him, I'm not going to come out swinging and just criticizing management for it, because at the end of the 2022-23 season, for example, he had a stretch where he finished with, I think it was 26 points in his last 33 games. And so a lot of people saw that and went, okay, like this guy might finally take the step and not just be a high-end third line center, but maybe he can be a serviceable enough second line center. Now, didn't happen this year. That's probably why now they're looking at their cap situation. Carolina has a bunch of free agents and they're going, well, maybe we need to shed some cap space here. I wouldn't be too keen on it if I was the Canucks, though.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on it. One thing we're obviously going to talk about when it comes to Necas and Kotkaniemi is the obvious question. Whenever trade talks happen, you always ask, okay, well, why do they want to get rid of this player? But we'll save that. We'll talk about that and the reason Carolina would want to maybe move on from either of these guys afterwards. But on Kotkaniemi, yeah, 12 goals, 15 assists through 79 games. He is signed for the next 5 years at $4.82 million. The one thing I thought about, though, is like, what is a third line center going to get paid by the time his deal is up? And I'm not trying to, I don't want to go too far down the road. I'm just saying, obviously, the cap is going up. We know that. And it feels like if the Canucks are going after him and they've liked him in the past, it feels like they've clearly done their homework on this player and they have a reason to like him, whether that is that they think he'll fit really well in their system. But I agree with you. The player that I'm more excited about is Martin Necas, and we'll circle back on Kotkaniemi. We'll talk about both of them. But
the other thing too is like if you're trading from, you're banking on a breakout, right? So you're not trading for the player that Kotkaniemi is right now. You're trading for him for the potential of what he could be. Whereas with Necas, the reason you're targeting him is like you already know that he's a proven top six forward. Plus, I'll also mention with Kotkaniemi, like if he was a high-end penalty killer, I'd be like, okay, like even though the offensive potential hasn't hit yet, like I wouldn't mind them rolling the dice on him as a long-term answer there. because as you mentioned, the cap is going to go up, and he really has a chance to grow into this cap hit, but hasn't killed penalties very often in Carolina. And if you're going to be a third line center, and especially more of a two-way type, that to me is an important box that I want a player to be checking.
Okay, so with Necas, the reason he's in trade talks because his dad said that he wanted to be traded, which is awesome. Like, I love that. His dad comes out in a Czech interview and says, yeah, it's time for him to be traded. It really doesn't sound like this is going to be a player that spends more time in Carolina. He's a restricted free agent. He's obviously going to need a new contract, and it really doesn't sound like he wants to stay in Carolina. Obviously has some power as an RFA, but that's simply put, that's the reason that the Carolina Hurricanes would be looking to trade a player like Martin Necas. What can you tell us about this player, Harm?
Well, it's not even just that he may be looking for a fresh start. It's that Carolina is facing a cap crunch this offseason. They've got, according to Cap Friendly, around $27 million in cap space. And I don't want to bore people with the details, but the context here will inform what Carolina is potentially looking for in a trade. So it's important to walk through. So they have around $27 million in cap space. They really want to re-sign Jake Gensel because he was a terrific fit for them. Now, you look at what Gensel might cost. We threw around a cap hit potentially starting with the number 9, but Pierre LeBrun had some reporting today over at The Athletic and was wondering if 8x8 might get it done, which on the lower end of what I thought Gensel would earn. But let's just assume for argument's sake that the Canes are able to re-sign him at $8 million.
Also worth mentioning with this new CBA, obviously, and I guess it's not that new, but like the Carolina Hurricanes are the only team that can sign him to an 8-year deal, right? Like he can only
Of
sign
course, yeah.
7 years in free agency. So even if it's an 8x8, that's still more total money than 9x7 or whatever, right?
Yeah, I think with 9x7 it'd be the same though, wouldn't it? Or no.
No, it'd be like
No,
1
you're
million
right.
less.
Yeah, you're right. Anyway, so let's say it's 8 million for Gensel. Clearly mental math is not my strength.
Oh, same here. I thought you were right for a second there.
No. Then let's say like they have their entire second pair of Shea and Pesci both becoming unrestricted free agents. It sounds like Pesci is the more likely one to walk. Shea has had a terrific year. They've got Orlov as potential insurance to step up into a top 4 role, but I can't imagine that they're gonna let both guys just go. Like they need another proven top 4 defenseman, even though they've got prospects like Scott Morrow's coming. They've got that Russian defenseman out of the KHL, really high end prospect Nikishin. There's question marks about whether he'll come in. So they have some talent, but imagine they want to keep one of those guys. So let's say, for argument's sake, Shea costs $6.5 million. Seth Jarvis is also an RFA. For argument's sake, let's say his number is around 7 million, right? At that point, and these are very like rough, like without having done a ton of research on these cap hits. But in that scenario, Carolina would have $5.5 million in cap space left with only 11 forwards and 6 defensemen signed, plus their goalies. That's not enough to fill out their depth spots and then sign Necas on top of that, given how productive he's been, because Necas also has arbitration rights. So that's, from a cap perspective, why they probably can't afford his next deal. I mean, sure, could they move around Kotkaniemi and move heaven and earth to find a way to make a Necas extension work? Sure, but the easier path for them is probably to cash in on his trade value. The reason I walk through all of that is, as we discuss, okay, well, what might Carolina be interested in? You have to keep in mind that because they want to keep Gensel, because they have needs to address on the back end, that they are probably going to want to make the type of trade where they gain cap space, unless the piece that you're giving back is like a core guy that they like would really want on, let's say, their blue line or their forward group.
Okay. I got a text during the show. And I got to say it because it's from one of our Finnish friends who covers the NHL, and he said, "Don't know if you look at your DMs during the show. I do, but Kotkaniemi loves Vancouver. It's his favorite road city. I remember speaking about it last year." So just interesting little nugget that I had to share, and I already asked if I could share it, and he said yes. So yeah, shout out to him. Shout out to him for sending me that. But with Kotkaniemi and Necas, can we pull up this trade proposal thing that I had for you, Grady. It was from Malcolm on Twitter, our pal Malcolm. Harmon, I threw this to you too. I texted it to you. And I know what your takeaway from it is. And I know Carolina probably says no, but for those on the podcast, I'll read it. To Carolina, Philip Hronek, don't have to do media in Carolina, Niels Höglander, Ilya Mikheyev, and to Vancouver, Martin Necas, Jesperi Kotkaniemi, and Scott Morrow. Scott Morrow, obviously the right shot blue liner that Faber was a huge fan of ahead of that draft. So those three players coming back to Vancouver. You get rid of Hronek, Höglander, and Mikheyev. The Canes have obviously been interested in Höglander in the past. I guess the question for you, Harm, other than breaking down this trade as a whole, how interested would the Carolina Hurricanes be in Philip Hronek?
That's $1 million question, right? I don't know, because that proposal you outlined to me, if I'm Carolina, that doesn't make a lot of sense because of the amount of salary you're taking back. Like, as a contending team, why would they want Ilya Mikheyev, right? Mikheyev has no finishing ability whatsoever. And if there's one attribute that Carolina doesn't need on their roster, it's more fast guys that don't know how to finish, right? Like, they're filled with players that drive possession, drive play, create chances, but suck at finishing. Like, they need more finishers, if anything. So like, because you're taking on like Hronek, his potential extension as well, Mikheyev's deal, like that's a lot of salary to take back. I don't think it makes sense from that perspective. However, the Hronek angle will be interesting. Again, just because his contract demands are so high, like my initial thought is I don't suspect that they'd have a ton of interest in him. But in having said that, they do need to solve their or make decisions on the back end. Only got 3 top 4 defensemen essentially signed when you think of Slavin, Burns, and Orlov presumably moving up. So they need a defenseman. It's just how much do they like Hronek compared to Pesci, compared to Shea, compared to some of the other options that they have. The other thing to keep in mind is Don Waddell just resigned from his position as general manager of the Carolina Hurricanes. Eric Tulsky is taking over as the interim GM. Can the Canes even make these types of decisions before they have clarity on their front office situation? Right? Like, how much power does Tulsky have right now? Especially because Tom Dundon, the owner of the Hurricanes, is a notoriously involved owner, right? He is probably one of the most active owners in the NHL. A lot of it comes down to him as well, and who knows what Tom Dundon thinks is in all of this as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I always try to tap into the mind of the owners, but I don't know. Like, you're right. You're right. It might not be something that's imminent, but it is interesting to hear these two names thrown out so early, I guess, into the Canucks off season. And I'm interested. I'm interested, man. Like, I'll be honest with you. Marty Necas especially seems like a really good fit on this team. And I don't know. Like, it's like I said earlier, if they go out and get Kotkaniemi, you're just thinking, okay, well, clearly they like this player. Clearly they think that a breakout is imminent and that they can do something. Back on that trade proposal, though, owner Quads took a look at what picks the Canucks have. Throw a first, throw a second, whatever you got to do, get it done. I like that trade. I say it every show.
I mean, yeah, it gets a lot done for the Canucks.
It gets so much done. Like, get rid of your first, get rid of your second. Who cares? Maybe both, and then get something else back. Like Scott Morrow, like we didn't even really touch on the Scott Morrow aspect of this. Has he like fallen off in recent years? Because I remember really liking him when I saw him.
I haven't tracked him too closely, but I still think he's on track to being a solid NHL defenseman.
Canucks Conversation is live Monday through Friday, every weekday at 2 p.m. over on the Canucks Army YouTube channel. Make sure you like, subscribe, and interact in the YouTube live chat every day with us, folks.